Hello viewers. In this episode of Pakistan Studies, I will explain the Minto-Morley Reforms of 1909. After watching the video, you will be able to answer all possible questions expected in your Cambridge exams. Minto-Morley Reforms. The Minto-Morley Reforms of 1909 were a set of changes made to India's political system by the British government. Named after Lord Minto, the British Viceroy, and Lord Morley, the Secretary of State for India. There were some reasons for British to introduce the Minto-Morley Reforms. To manage growing discontent. By the early 1900s, there was increasing unrest in India due to British rule, especially during Swadeshi movement. The British hoped to win the support of Hindus and hoped that the reforms would ease tensions and prevent widespread protests. To address Indian demands for representation. Indians, especially the Indian National Congress, had long demanded more political representation. The British introduced the reforms to address this demand, but in a controlled and limited way. To secure Muslim support, the British wanted to gain the loyalty of the Muslim elite. The demand for separate electorates for Muslims was first presented during the Shimla Deputation of 1906. The British granted this demand as only Muslims supported partition of Bengal. The reforms made key changes to legislative system. Increased Indian representation. More Indians were given seats in the legislative councils, though the British still held a majority. Separate electorates for Muslims. Muslims were granted separate electorates, meaning they could elect their own representatives instead of voting alongside Hindus. Expansion of legislative councils. The number of non-official members were increased, but still official British members dominated the assemblies. Let me tell you the difference between an official and non-official member. Official members were civil servants or British officials directly appointed by the British government. On the other hand, non-officials were Indian leaders. By keeping the number of non-official members low, the British ensured that they could easily outvote the Indian representatives in legislative councils. Benefits of the reforms. The reforms gave more Indians a voice in governance, allowing them to participate in legislative councils and have some influence on policies. By granting separate electorates for Muslims, the reforms acknowledged their political identity and gave them and ensuring their political representation. The reforms helped reduce some of the political unrest in India by offering limited concessions. Criticism. Despite the increase in Indian representation, the British still maintained control, and Indians had little real power in the legislative councils, which were dominated by British officials. The separate electorates created divisions between Hindus and Muslims, weakening the united political movement. Hindus didn't like it and opposed it. The reforms were seen as insufficient by Indians. Official member was still in the majority, limiting Indian influence on future legislations.